All right, we were talking last time before the exam. We were talking about classical Greece. We were talking about the period of the classical period, 5th and 4th centuries BC, when the Greek city-states were really at their height in terms of their cultural achievements and their political independence, their political power, their standing in the ancient world. For a while there, remember, the Greek city-states were able to ward off the mighty and powerful Persian Empire. So the Greek city-states were at their height in the classical period. Now, eventually what would happen, as we saw, their constant bickering and wars and conflicts would eventually result in them losing their independence. And the people who would be the people who would conquer Greece would be not the Persians, but a people called the Macedonians, who lived in what is today, well, Macedonia, to the north of Greece in the Balkans, a mountainous region. And the Macedonians are a case in point where you have a people who were not Greek, but were shaped and influenced by Greek civilization to the extent that they made it their own. And that would be true of Philip II, who was the great statesman who transformed Macedonia from a little country kingdom to a mighty world power, and his son, the great Alexander the Great, the conqueror, who felled the great mighty Persian Empire during his lifetime. But these two men, the father and son, were both Macedonians, but they had adopted Greek civilization as their own. And with Alexander's conquests, the whole Near East world would come under Greek influence. So in the period that follows Alexander, it's sometimes called the Hellenistic world. Hellene means Greek, but this is a period when you have not just Greeks, but Greeks and Persians and Egyptians and Babylonians all being influenced by Greek civilization. So it's Hellenistic, not just Hellene. So it's a Hellenistic period. And we see a synthesis occurring where we see ideas from the ancient Near East, especially in the realm of religion, intermixing and intermingling with Greek concepts. So it was a great time of cultural diversity and mingling. Now, at the same time that this was going on in the East, over in the West, in the Western Mediterranean, in Italy, Rome was a state that, the Romans spoke their own language. They spoke Latin. They had their own culture, religion to a certain degree. But from their very beginning, the Romans were shaped and influenced, just like the Macedonians, by Greek civilization. And they would take it and make it their own. In fact, sometimes historians refer to Greco-Roman civilization, because the two Greek and Roman civilizations were so blended and so intermixed with one another. In fact, the Romans didn't even bother to change any of the Greek myths. They just took all the Greek myths and put in Roman names for the gods. So like Zeus became Jupiter, and Hera became Juno, and Athena became Minerva. So they just basically took the Greek gods and adopted the whole Greek mythology as their own, but they just identified the Greek gods with their own gods that they worship. So they can even create personalities for their gods. They were all borrowed from the Greeks, and they were in many ways they're shaped by the Greeks, but in certain areas they excelled the Greeks, like in law, and in another area was in public architecture, like in bridges and roads and huge public buildings. So the Romans were definitely a very ingenious people, but they were heavily indebted to the Greek civilization. And they take Greek civilization, the achievements of the Greeks, and they transmitted it to Europe. France, Spain, all speak Romance languages. It's not like they're romantic. It's not like they're full of love in France or Spain. No. Romantic languages refers to the fact that Spanish and French are both derived from Latin, the language spoken by the Romans. Just like modern Italian is derived from ancient Latin. And so, in many ways, the Romans gave birth to Western European civilization by transmitting all the glory that was Greece, all the achievements of Greece, taking that and transmitting it and spreading it to the indigenous Celtic peoples of Ireland and England and France and Spain. I mean, a lot of these peoples in Ireland was never even conquered by the Romans. They thought it was not worth their time. Tell that to an Irishman. And but Irish and the British were influenced by Roman civilization. All right, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Today we're going to talk about the Hellenistic period first, and then we're going to talk about the early history of Rome. And another reason why Rome is so important to us as Americans, of course, is that our own founding fathers, and the whole phrase founding fathers goes right back to the Romans. Our own founding fathers, Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, Washington, they're all influenced by the Roman Republic. In fact, the Senate and a lot of the terms that we use, veto, a lot of the terms we use in our own government are derived from ancient Rome, because our founding fathers saw the American Republic as being modeled after the ancient Roman Republic. So Rome, and that's when you go to the capital today, if you go to Washington, D.C. and see the Capitol building, which is another derived from the Roman word capital. If you go to the Capitol, the White House, it's all Greco-Roman architecture. Why? Because when Washington was being planned and built beginning in 1790, they modeled it after an ancient Roman city. That's why it has all this Roman architecture built into it. That's another great reason to understand and learn about the history of Rome, and especially the Roman Republic. All right, so we're going to begin with the Hellenistic period. Now, we already discussed how the Greek city-states were, at the end of the 4th century, were exhausted by constant wars with one another. You know, all the Greek city-states wanted to be the hegemonic power, the number one power. Now, eventually, Philip of Macedon was, like I said, he ruled this country to the north. The Macedonians were very rural. They didn't have cities. The Philip of Macedon, the king, ruled over a population of mostly farmers. And you also had this landed aristocracy. Now, Philip of Macedon, what he did was that he had spent some time actually as a hostage in the Greek city-state of Thebes. So he was kind of grew up in Greece. And when he became king of Macedon, he decided that he was going to really transform the Macedonian military based on some developments that he saw in Greece. So one of the things he realized, he needed a strong, well-trained army. So he recruited among his peasants, among the country folk, and he built a real strong, solid infantry. Now, he made some modifications with the Greek phalanx in the sense that he made the weapons even more terrifying. Instead of having just a heavy spear, he created 16-foot-long pikes. In fact, they were so heavy that you had the soldier had to carry it in two hands and then strap his shield to his arm. That's how heavy they're called sarissas. And they were so he created this really strong, solid, powerful phalanx. And he just trained his peasants till they were a machine. And then another thing he did that was different was that before Philip came along, cavalry kind of did their own thing. Cavalry, and when a battle was fought, you'd have a cavalry battle and then an infantry battle, and there wasn't much going on in between. But Philip II decided to use the cavalry as kind of as a weapon, as kind of like to drive the enemy into the phalanx. So he integrated the cavalry into the battle plan. And so he created and the cavalry were all fellow aristocrats. You know, in the Macedonian monarchy, the king was like the first among equals, and his cavalry were made up of the landed aristocrats of Macedon. And they formed the really strong, loyal cavalry. So Philip of Macedon, he created a strong army. Now, he was fortunate that early on in his career, he was able to he came in control of some gold mines, literally gold mines, which is always a good thing to have gold, right? And so he could use that gold to buy weapons and if he needed some extra mercenaries, Greek mercenaries, to supplement his Macedonian army, he could do so. So he was a very effective king, and through war and diplomacy, he was able to divide and conquer, to play one Greek city-state against another. Now, eventually, the Greek city-states realized that they needed to stop their fighting among themselves, that Philip II was becoming too powerful. But when they finally came to that realization, it was too late. Now, eventually, Thebes and Athens decided to put aside their ancient rivalry and to fight together. Now, Sparta still wouldn't have anything to do with either one of them. But it was just Thebes and Athens. And there was a great battle fought in central Greece at a battle called Chaeronea in 338 BC. And it was at this battle, decisive battle, that the Macedonians carried the day. Philip's son Alexander, who was just 20 years old at the time, he led the charge, and the cavalry just wiped up the Theban saber band, just demolished them, and that was it. And after that, Macedon was the most powerful state. And now Philip II was a smart guy. He realized that he needed to find a way to bring some kind of unity, that the Greek city-states, he didn't want to have to be dealing with these Greek city-states all the time. He knew that they weren't going to go down easy. So he tried to find some way to unite them. So he decided right after his victory that he was going to lead a league of Greek city-states in a war of revenge against Persia. He was going to take the war against Persia because he figured, well, all the Greeks know that the Persian is the enemy. So maybe if I can unite all the Greeks and they'll hate the Persians instead of me, that would be a good thing. So Philip II had plans of leading a great army against the Persians as a way of trying to unite the Greek city-states under his leadership. Now, before he could do so, though, in 336, Philip II was assassinated. He was killed by a Macedonian who he had wronged, so he was assassinated, and that left the throne to his 20-something son, Alexander the Great. Well, he wasn't called the Great at that time. He would earn that title. Now, Alexander, first thing he decided to do was to go ahead and lead this campaign against Persia. And that's what he did. And he's considered one of the great generals in all of world history, because basically he had an army of about 30,000 some Macedonians with a couple of thousand Greek mercenaries as aid. And he led this army, and over the course of about 13 years or so, he was able to conquer the entire Persian Empire. Now, I'll just give you, see if I can get this map to work here. Now you can see, here's Macedon. Macedon's right here. Let me get this map a little bigger. All right, Macedon's right here. Oh, well, I lost it. Okay, yeah. Macedon's right here, and you can see his route he took. His army started, they crossed over into Asia Minor, and you look at this route here. They went from Macedon in the Balkans all the way to India, to what is today Pakistan. And now the one reason why Alexander was so successful in defeating the Persians was the same reason that earlier in history the Greeks had defeated the massive armies of the Persians in the Persian Wars. The Persians would be able to put huge armies into the field, like at the Battle of Gaugamela, fought in what today would be Western Iran. At this battle, supposedly the Persians had put together an army of over 1 million men, and the Greeks, the Macedonians, had 30-some thousand. But at the battle, Alexander realized that the only thing that these Persians had in common was the Persian king Darius III. Although they might have 1 million troops or so in the field, but most of them were draftees, subject peoples who had been forced into the military, didn't really want to be there. So in the battle, all Alexander had to do was focus all of his energy and all of his forces on the position of Darius. And when Darius saw at this battle that he was in danger, he fled. He just got out of there. He didn't want to die, right? And once he fled, all these other people were thinking, well, he's our leader. If he doesn't want to be here, I certainly don't want to be here. And they all scattered. So basically it was like you it's like when you take out a snake. You know, they always say with the snake, you grab him by the head. I've never done this before, but I was told by an animal control officer when I had a snake in my garage, oh, just grab it by the head, and you'll have it. I ended up smashing that thing with a shovel. Yeah,
that's right.
but that's what they said. Oh yeah, but there must be some truth to that, because an animal control officer from Johnson City would never tell me a lie.
It sounds like something my brother would tell me.
Yeah.
Just grab it by the head.
Grab it by the head, but it works in armies. You know, he attacked the head. He attacked Darius III. Darius III fled, and the whole army collapsed. Now, the great story about Alexander is that after this defeat, Darius III, the Persian king, was ashamed. But the leading Persians were like, hey, this guy's a failure. So they assassinated him, and one of their own declared himself to be the Persian king. Well, at this point, Alexander says, oh, I'm the new Persian king, and I'm going to avenge the death of my friend Darius III, my friend, quote unquote, because and I'm gonna marry his daughter. So even after defeating Darius III, Alexander decided, well, hey, I'll become the new Persian king. You know, the Macedonians were very imitative. You know, Alexander, when he started the campaign, was Mr. Greek. You know, even though he wasn't Greek, he loved Greek. Everything about Greece. His tutor was the great philosopher Aristotle. But once he got fighting the Persians, he said, boy, these Persians are pretty cool. I like the Persians. I want to be like the Persians. I'm the new Persian king. So he started adopting Persian customs. You know, once he was living among the Persians. And now eventually his armies made it all the way to Central Asia. They crossed the Indus River and fought against the kings of India in what today would be central Pakistan. And he wanted to keep on going. He was ready to go. He was ready to keep on marching all the way to the Ganges in the heart of India. But his soldiers at this point said, look, we love you, king, but we're tired. We want to go home. So he stopped his campaign and returned a very difficult trek across deserts and mountains. Finally made his way back to Babylon in Mesopotamia. And he, in 323, he was only in his 30s at the time, he died. According to one report, he died because he drank too much. According to another report, he had heavy wounds from his years of fighting, and that eventually the wounds kind of caught up. Now, you could probably take those two stories together and say probably he was drinking a lot because he was in a lot of pain, and eventually the drinking and the pain and all the injuries that he suffered during the war probably did him in. Now, so in a very short period, he conquered this massive empire you see here, stretching from the Aegean all the way to Central Asia. Now, when he died, his wife was pregnant at the time. His wife, Roxanne! That was her name, Roxanne. Yeah. It was probably that's what Roxanne, you got my baby! That's what he was singing to her, I'm sure. You know. But no, she was a Afghan princess. She wasn't Macedonian, but she was pregnant. So there really wasn't, nobody knew if she was going to have a boy or a girl. Nobody really knew. And on his deathbed, when they kept asking him, who's the next king? He said, whoever's the strongest. And then he died. Now, what happened after his death, though, was literally there was a struggle for the throne. All of his generals, you've got to remember that his cavalry generals, his officers, were all Macedonian nobility. And all of them had some link to the royal family in terms of blood connection. So all the Macedonian nobility kind of saw themselves as being potential kings of Macedon. So when Alexander died without a clear successor, you had all these Macedonian generals, these aristocrats, thinking, hey, I could be the next king of Macedon. I could be the heir of this empire. But you see, you had a whole bunch of them. So in the end, you had what's called the Wars of the Successors. These are the successors of Alexander. And these wars raged on for 50 years. You had first the generals of Alexander fighting among themselves, and then you had their children fighting among themselves. And one of the more interesting successors wasn't even actually Macedonian at all. It was a man by the name of Pyrrhus. You can have his picture. Pyrrhus was actually Alexander's cousin. His Epirus, the land of Epirus, is what is today Albania, and it was another land like Macedon that had its own culture and language, but had adopted Greek civilization as its own. And Epirus, Pyrrhus was the king of Epirus, and he was the cousin of Alexander, and he figured that if his cousin could have so much great success, he could as well. And he commanded, at one point he was such a great military commander and leader of men that at one point the Macedonian soldiers were so impressed by him that they made him his king. Just to give you an idea of the spirit of the age, there's a great story about Pyrrhus of Epirus. He was incredibly strong and great soldier, and he was fighting against this one barbarian tribe, and one of the emissaries from the barbarian tribe was kind of getting in his face. So Epirus grabbed his sword and just brought his sword down on the guy's head and split the guy's head in two. Now, I don't believe that story, because skull is pretty tough. But this guy was supposedly so strong that he was able to split the guy in two and break open his head. And the barbarian tribe was so impressed that they made him his king and they worshipped him as a god. He said, "You're our king. You're so powerful," you know. And that was his. That was the kind of guy he was. He was very charismatic, and he never lost a battle. He only lost one battle in his whole life, and that was against the Romans. But we'll talk about that later. But you had all these wars and all this bloodshed, and in fact, when Pyrrhus of Epirus was actually killed, that really marked an end of an era. He was the last big warrior of the successors of Alexander. When he died in 272 BC, that marked the end of the wars of successors. Now, the irony of it is that the great warrior, the great king, you know how he died? An old lady threw a brick at him and it hit his head. That's a true story. He was fighting in a battle, and he was about to kill this kid, and the kid's mom was up on the rooftop, seeing they were fighting in a street battle, and she saw it, and she just threw a brick, and it was just hit him like right here, hit him on the back of his head. Now, that blow they didn't think killed him, but it dazed him. So the kid, when he saw the guy dazed, grabbed his sword and ran through, and that was the end of Pyrrhus. So he got. I don't know. And you don't have to wonder whether that story is true, because it just seems too perfect. But anyway, question.
Did you say what happened to Alexander's son?
Oh well, he did eventually have a son who was born from Roxanne, but both the mother and the son were murdered by the successors. Once they were calling the shots, they wanted to get rid of the kid so they could run the empire themselves. Now, eventually, what happened was that eventually 3 of the generals of Alexander, their families divided up Alexander's empire. So you had one of the generals was Antigonus, and the descendants of Antigonus, they ruled over Macedonia and Greece.
Who are these guys again?
These are the generals of Alexander and their descendants. Now, another general who fought for Alexander was Seleucus, and he had his descendants. They ruled over the biggest chunk. They ruled over an empire that its height stretched from Asia Minor, what is today Turkey, all the way to India, and they were known as the Seleucids. And then another general, Ptolemy, he ruled over Egypt. Now, in terms of territory, you'd think Seleucus had the biggest territory. You'd think he'd be the most powerful. But you see, given all, there was a kind of a balance. One reason why you had an end to the wars of successors is by the 3rd century BC, these 3 states had developed an equilibrium. There was a balance of power. You see, Seleucus' empire was huge. Good.
Can you say the third guy's name again?
Ptolemy.
Ptolemy?
Yeah, it looks like Ptolemy, but it's just Ptolemy. You see, Seleucus' empire stretched from here all the way to India. It was huge, but that was its biggest weakness, was that it was so big that it was hard to control all those different peoples, and there were a lot of communication problems. Ptolemy ruled over Egypt, which was much smaller, but it was a much more compact kingdom. And plus, Egypt was immensely wealthy, you know, with the Nile River and all that grain. It was a very wealthy, rich area. So the Ptolemies, what they didn't have in terms of land, they had in terms of quality. They had a lot of wealth. Now, the Antigonids, who ruled Greece and Macedonia, they didn't have any lot of resources. Their greatest resource was that they had Greeks and Macedonians. You see, with all three of these empires, the military was made up of Macedonians and Greeks. So basically, the Egyptian ruler, the Ptolemies, and the Syrian or the Seleucid ruler, they had to continually recruit Greeks and Macedonians to serve in their military, to serve in their armies, because they couldn't trust or couldn't count on the indigenous population. You know, all during the time that the Ptolemies ruled over Egypt, till almost to the very end, they did not recruit native Egyptians into their armies. Only toward the end did they do so. But all these states relied on Greeks and Macedonians to serve as not only as their military soldiers, but also as administrators, you know, bureaucrats, you know, tax collectors and so forth, to run these empires. So the Antigonids ruled the smallest amount of territory, Greece and Macedon, but they had a wealth of Greeks. They didn't have to recruit from beyond their empire to provide an army. So that gave them that kind of advantage. So you had these three kingdoms, all kind of counterbalancing. So you have the Antigonids.
You have a subcategory under Ptolemy that's Alexandria. Is that?
Yeah, that was that. Here's Alexandria right here. So here's the Ptolemies. Here's the Antigonids.
So,
and here's the Seleucids.
So that Alexandria really needs to be a subcategory under Ptolemy in Egypt.
Yeah. I'll get to that. Yeah. Now in this world, in the Hellenistic world, what we see happening is that the Greeks and the Macedonians who settled in Egypt and settled in the Seleucid Empire, they brought their Greek civilization with them, and so they established new Greek cities in the middle of the Near East. Now, Alexandria is located in Egypt. It's still a city today, but it was founded by Alexander the Great himself, and it would become the capital of the Ptolemies. The family of Ptolemy would rule Alexandria. That's where they would build their palace. They built the great library of Alexandria as a great center of research, and they had the biggest library the world had seen up to that point, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of volumes. And it was a Greek city in the middle of Egypt, well, in the north of Egypt. Yes.
Didn't something happen to their library?
Yeah, it was burned, but that was later in history. That was later. Yeah, there's a bunch of different times the library was burned.
Burned down several times.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
The first time was by the Romans.
That's what I was thinking.
So Alexandria was a Greek city in the middle of Egypt. So the reason for that was that the Ptolemies, they needed Greeks and Macedonians to be in their military, and they needed Greeks to run their government. So to accommodate the Greeks, they had to build Greek cities for these Greek immigrants to live in. Now, over time, you have a situation where the native populations, native Egyptians who moved to Alexandria, might adopt Greek civilization as their own. And over time, Greek became more and more spoken even by non-Greeks. Egyptians over time adopted, in some places, the Greek language as their own. But that was a process that took centuries. Now, another great city would be Antioch. Antioch was named after Antiochus, one of the kings of the Seleucids, a Seleucid king, and Antioch was located in what is today Syria. Actually, it's located right on the border right on the Turkish-Syrian border today. But it was a great city, like Alexandria, with hundreds of thousands of people. But it was a Greek city in the middle of the Near East. Now, just to give you another example, if you guys are familiar with the New Testament. In the New Testament, a lot of times you hear about the Decapolis, the 10 cities. That's what Decapolis means. It was sometimes in the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, you hear about Jesus traveling in the area of the Decapolis. I mean, I think it was one of those in the area of the Decapolis that he turned a bunch of demons into a bunch of herd of pigs, and they jumped into the Sea of Galilee and drowned. Well, the Decapolis were Greek cities that had been founded by the Seleucids as a place where their Greek soldiers could live. So it was a bunch of cities in what is today Galilee and what is today Israel that was inhabited originally by Greek colonists, Greek mercenaries who were brought in and settled there to serve as soldiers and administrators for the Seleucids. And even after the Seleucid Empire ceased to exist, in that area, Greek was the language spoken by the people who lived in those cities.
So the Gadarenes were a part of the Decapolis?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's the city. Can't remember. I think it's. Can't remember which of the cities it was part of. The territory of. Yeah, but it was in the region of the Decapolis. A lot of times, these cities, their municipal boundaries would include the rural countryside that surrounded the city.
So is Antioch part of Ptolemy's?
No, Antioch would be a great Greek city, but would be in the Seleucid Empire.
Okay.
Now this Hellenization process, this process of establishing Greek cities in the Near East, extended well beyond just Egypt and Syria. It extended all the way into what is today Afghanistan. The ancient word for Afghanistan the ancient name for it was Bactria, and the Bactrians were an Iranian people. They were related ethnically to other Iranian peoples like the Persians and the Medes. And some years ago, right after World War II, a French archaeologist excavated a site in the middle of Afghanistan that was a full-fledged Greek city. We don't even, there's some discussion about what the ancient Greek name for the city, but it's the site of Ai-Khanoum. That's the modern name for it. But it's a full-fledged Greek city. They found a theater, they found a library, they found a gymnasium, which was the Greek word for school. So they found a Greek school, they found a library, they found a theater in the middle of Afghanistan, probably founded in about the 3rd century BC or so by the Seleucids as a way of providing land and a cultural environment for the Greek colonists that they were bringing in to settle in this region. So Greek influence extended all the way deep into the heart of Central Asia as a result of these conquests. Now, something that happened that was important is that you had a lot of interaction between Greeks and non-Greeks. And in some areas, this led to what we call syncretism, where Near Eastern beliefs, especially religious beliefs, would be adopted by the Greeks and influenced by the Greeks. And so what we see happening is that some of these religions that were native to the Near East and to Asia were adopted by the Greeks. Like, for example, Mithras. Mithras is the Iranian sun god. He was an Iranian sun god worshipped by the early, even by the Mitanni and later by the Medes. And they became, in the Hellenistic period, they had this big cult of Mithras. It was a mystery cult where you had to go through different initiations. At one point, you had to be bathed in a bull's blood. It was only men could join. You had to be a man. Women weren't allowed to become followers of Mithras. But it was very popular, even in the days of the Romans. In fact, during the period of the Roman Empire, many Roman soldiers became followers of Mithras. So it was a cult that started in the Hellenistic period and extended for centuries. Another cult was Isis. Isis, we've already mentioned Isis. She was an Egyptian goddess, but she became worshipped throughout the Hellenistic world and into the Roman period. And
so Mithras was what?
He was a Iranian sun god who was adopted as a cult in the by Greeks, worshipped by Greeks and later by Romans. And the same, Isis was an Egyptian fertility goddess, but it was believed that by worshiping Isis, she would get you in good in the underworld so you could live a fruitful life after death, you know, in paradise or whatever, the land of the Elysian fields when you died. And now I mention these things because in many ways these cults kind of laid the groundwork for the rapid spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire, because in both cases you had a situation where people living in cities were open to the idea of religions from the Near East and joining such a religion as a part of your life. You know, you didn't have to just worship the local city gods anymore. And so these religions that came from the Near East, it spread, and it became common for many Greeks and later Romans to adopt these Near Eastern religions. And in a lot of ways, that laid the groundwork for when Christianity was also a religion from the East that spread following the same kind of network in terms of spreading through trading patterns, just like these earlier religions, these syncretic religions of the Hellenistic period, like Mithras and Isis.
Well, a good example of that is when Paul gave his discord in Greece, in Athens, and he I forget the name of the rock outcropping, but it had the unknown god was a
the Areopagus, yeah.
And he gave his famous discord to all the great Greek philosophers that, you know, I noticed that you placed this plaque on the wall with the unknown god. Well, let me tell you about it.
Yeah, well, that'd be because that, you know, I was mentioning, but there was all these other people from the Near East coming and talking, and so that was something that was made possible by the environment of the period, where you have people with different ideas willing to come together and talk and discuss. All right, so that was the Hellenistic age. All right, now we're going to talk about Rome, the glory that was Rome. Now Rome, like I said, the Romans were originally a people that spoke Latin. They lived in central Italy, but the Romans adopted a lot of the culture that was ancient Greek. In fact, Rome started out as a city-state. It started out as a city-state, just like Athens, just like Sparta. I mean, the idea of the city-state was borrowed by the Romans from the Greeks. So Rome started out as a city-state, and even the name of their government reflected Greek influence. The Romans called their government, when they first were started, they called their city-state a res publica. Now, it's from res publica we get the word republic, and literally, in a literal translation of res publica is commonwealth, or the common good, or common things. Because the Romans believed, just like the ancient Greeks, that going back, we talked about Solon and the Spartans, and they believed that the state belonged to all the people, that the government was the affair of all citizens. So the Romans kind of got the idea from the Greeks and made it their own. Now, the thing about the Romans was that their idea of citizenship that they developed was unique to them, in the sense that the Romans came to believe that being a Roman citizen was not a matter of being born a Roman. Being a Roman citizen meant having the rights of being a Roman. If you had the right of Roman citizenship, you were a Roman. Didn't matter who your father was, who your mother was, what country you came from. Didn't matter. Being a Roman meant having Roman citizenship. So if you received a grant of Roman citizenship, you were equal to all other Romans, whoever they were, whenever they were born, if they were born in Romans or not. And see, this gave the advantage to the Romans, because the Romans, over time, they could expand their citizenship roles. Remember, we talked about one of the reasons why the Athenians were so strong militarily was because they gave the right to participate in the government to so many people, and Athens was much larger than most city-states, and so every citizen could be a soldier. And that meant that the Athenians always had good, strong, large armies compared to other Greek city-states. Well, the Romans, they could create huge armies because they gave citizenship out to anybody who wanted to be a Roman, who was going to be a good, loyal Roman. So the Romans, over time, were able to create a huge mass of Roman citizens, all of them who could serve and fight for the Roman state. And that was really something that made the Roman state so strong and so militarily tough. It wasn't the quality of their soldiers, it was the fact that they could put so many soldiers into the field, and that they were loyal to the idea of the Roman government. All right, so just look at this map here. Here's Rome in central Italy. Now, the Romans were able to build an empire that by the time you get to the first century, by the time of Christ, extended from the Euphrates all the way to the Atlantic, from the North Sea all the way to the Sahara. I mean, it was one of the biggest, longest lasting empires in world history. And a lot of the success of the Roman Empire is due to the fact that they had this very strong concept of Roman citizenship. Being a Roman meant you had certain rights. Right to marry, right to pass on property to your kids, right to a fair trial, certain rights that you were guaranteed by being a Roman citizen. And just to give you, some of you might be familiar with the New Testament, and in the book of Acts, which is later in Roman history, but in the first century or so, St. Paul, he gets whipped, and after he's whipped, he just passes on to the information, oh, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen. And the guy's like, oh my God, I whipped the Roman citizen! Because you didn't whip Roman citizenship. If you were a Roman citizen, you didn't get whipped. That meant you were a full-fledged man with rights, and you had a right to a trial. You couldn't be whipped. You couldn't die a horrible death. You couldn't be tortured. And the guy was just beside himself after that. He was just begging Paul not to bring charges against him, basically. But that's what it meant to be a Roman citizen. And Paul wasn't even born in Rome. He was a Roman citizen, but he was born in Turkey. He was born in right over here in Tarsus in Cilicia, in this area here. But he was a Roman citizen, and by virtue of being a Roman citizen, he had certain rights, like he couldn't be whipped at all, and he was guaranteed a right to a fair trial. So the Romans were able to build a citizenship base of good, strong citizens who were willing to fight and die and serve Rome, and that was really something that gave them strength over the years and allowed them to create this massive, very stable empire over time. All right, now another thing about the Romans was that the Romans were very conservative. It had a lot to do with their religion. The Roman religion was very focused on honoring one's ancestors. All your ancestors you would honor with prayers and rituals. And when a man died, they would make a mask of clay of his face. It was called a death mask. And they would hang these death masks in their house and in a room for everybody to see. And every Roman kid would have to learn the names of all of his ancestors going back generations and know about what they had done and what they had achieved. So honoring and respecting one's ancestors was very important to the Romans. The Romans called their homeland the fatherland. In fact, we get the word patriotism from the Roman word patria, which means fatherland. So the Romans were very loyal to their country, loyal to their ancestors, and they had a phrase called way of the ancestors, the mos maiorum. And they believed that it was very important to be true to one's traditions and background, and so the Roman state, that was another source of early on in its history. That was another source of Roman stability over time, was the fact that the Romans were so adhered so much to their traditions and their ancient laws.
So many cultures imitate the other. I mean, Greek or Roman borrowed so much from Greek. We borrowed so much from Roman and Greek. Nazi Germany tried to imitate Rome with their, fatherland.
Yeah. Well, different cultures take different things from these people, and make it their own. Now the Romans told a story about their foundation, and these stories were a source of inspiration to the Romans. They tell us a lot about their values and what they believed and what they considered to be true. And these stories do have a basis in historical fact. So they can't just be simply dismissed as myths or stories, made-up stories. Now, the Romans believed that the ancestor of Rome, the founder of Rome, were two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, and they lived in Latium. Latium is in central Italy. That was the homeland of the Latin-speaking peoples. Latin comes from Latium. And Romulus and Remus, the story goes, was that their mother was a princess. She was the daughter of the king of Latium. And now she was supposed to be a Vestal virgin, which means that she was supposed to remain a virgin. That's in honor of the goddess Vesta. Well, she got pregnant. And when she got pregnant, she said, well, I was sleeping along the riverbank, and the god Mars came upon me and raped me. And they're like, yeah, right. You're just a whore. So they buried her alive because she's a Vestal virgin and she'd broken her vow. But after she had given birth to her sons, they took the sons and they exposed them. They were going to kill them. They just left them to die. But it so happened that a wolf came along, famous statue here. A wolf came along, a pregnant wolf, and she nursed the two little baby boys. And later on, they were found by shepherds, and the shepherds raised Romulus and Remus. Now, there's a couple of things about that story. Mars, the supposed father of Romulus and Remus, he's the Greek god of war. The Ares and Mars were equated. So in Greek mythology, he was the god of war. But for the Romans, Mars was more than the god of war. He was the god of boundaries, too. You go to war to defend your boundaries. The Romans were very interested in these are the laws, these are the boundaries. You break the law, you get punished. You violate the boundary, you get attacked. The Romans were very much into defending and protecting the homeland, defending the boundaries. So, in their view, having the father of the founders of Rome being Mars made perfect sense. All right. So Romulus and Remus, the story goes. Uh-oh, you got that off here? All right. Boy, it's like a show here today. Right? Where's the lights?
Yeah, where's the
we need
lights?
some
Strobe
lights
yeah.
to go through here. All right. Now the story goes is that Romulus and Remus, they decided that they were going to found a city, and they put out a notice that said if you're in debt, if you're in trouble with the law, if you need a new place to stay, join us. We're going to form a new city. And that was important because the idea was that these were nobodies, these were outcasts, these were losers, these were lawbreakers. But now they were going to be somebody. They were going to be the new Romans, the new men, and they were going to found a city. And that was very important idea. See, they could be nobodies, but now Romulus and Remus were making them Romans. Now Romulus and Remus, when they first started building their city, the story goes is that Romulus built a wall around the Palatine Hill. He built this wall, and Remus started making fun of him. He said, "Oh, your wall sucks. You think you're all hot stuff with your wall." So he jumped over the wall, and Romulus said, "Nobody attacks my wall. Nobody violates my boundary." And he struck his brother dead, killed his brother. And the Romans said, "See, you don't mess with our boundaries. Once a wall is built, you defend that wall." So Romulus killed his brother. That's why the city was called Rome, not Rheme. That'd be kind of a lousy city. Yes.
His younger brother, correct?
No, they were twins.
Oh yeah, they were twins.
They were twins.
Still,
Yeah.
one was younger than the other.
Well, yeah, technically, yeah. One came out later than the other. I don't know which one.
Minutes.
I'd hate to been the woman if she had both of them at the same time.
Now it gets better. This story gets better. Now the Romans. Now the story goes is that Romulus and Remus, they started their city, but it was a bunch of guys, and they knew that with a bunch of guys, the city wasn't going to last very long. They needed wives, but nobody wanted to marry these Roman men because they were losers. They were all outcasts and lawbreakers, so nobody wanted to marry them. So they said, "Okay, we're going to do a trick." So Romulus said, "Oh, we're having a big festival, and we're going to have a big festival." And he invited a people called the Sabines, who were neighbors. They were the hillbillies who lived in the hills to to the east of Rome. He invited the Sabines. He said, now when you come to our festival, bring all your unmarried daughters and sisters with you. Oh yeah, sure, yeah. So they brought them all, and then when they're having the festival, at a signal, the Romans seized all the unmarried girls and forced all the men out of the city. And they said, now we got ourselves some wives. Now we can start our city. Well, anyway, the Sabines were kind of mad about that, right? So they brought an army. They brought an army against the Romans. And the two sides were about to go to battle. And they were about to fight each other. When the Sabine wives, these new wives, they said, hey, we like our husbands. They treat us nice. They're good guys. And so the Sabines said, okay, well, as long as our daughters and our sisters are happy, we'll make peace. And so the Romans and the Sabines decided to become one and to join together. And see, that's another key thing about the Romans. See, the Sabines weren't ethnic Latins. They spoke a different language. They spoke a language called Oscan. Yet they were made part of Rome. And this is one of the earliest traditions. Yeah, question?
We always hear about languages that come from Latin. Where did Latin come from?
It's what we call an Indo-European language, like Greek and French and Iranian and Sanskrit. It's a Indo-European language.
So there's like common language.
Theoretically, it's believed that Indo-European. There was at one point a single Indo-European language that was spoken, but there's no evidence of it. It's just a theoretical possibility. Now, there's some people who believe that Indo-Europeans are descended from Neolithic farmers who originally had their home in the Near East, who spread and brought farming with them into Anatolia and then all the way into Europe and eventually into Greece and Italy and all that. Because in the Indo-European languages, there are some very early Semitic loanwords. So at some point in history, Indo-Europeans were living very closely to Semitic peoples, like the Babylonians and the Hebrews and all that. But they moved and eventually settled in all of Europe. All right. Now, and the Oscans, the Sabines, were also spoken Indo-European language. It's just a different language originally. Just like English and German are different Indo-European languages. All right. Now the story goes is that the Romans were the first Romans were ruled by kings, and eventually a man by the name of Tarquin became the king of Rome. Now Tarquin, his name means literally the Etruscan. That's what his name means, and he was from the land of the Etruscans, which was to the north of Rome, and Tarquin ruled over Rome. And now eventually in about 509 BC, what happened was that the last Tarquin ruler of Rome was a man by the name of Tarquin the Proud, Tarquin Superbus. And he was a very vicious king according to tradition. And the Romans didn't like being ruled by him. So eventually the Romans found a leader, and a man by the name of Brutus. And in 509 BC, that's a traditional date for Brutus. Brutus and the Romans expelled the last Etruscan king, Tarquin, kicked him out. Now the story is, this is a great story too. The story is that the last Etruscan king, what was the final blow to the last Etruscan king was that he raped a married woman. Yeah, there was this girl named Lucretia, and he supposedly, she was a married woman, young married woman, and he raped her. The king, the tyrant, raped her. And when after she was raped, she was so humiliated she committed suicide. And for the Romans, that was the last blow. And so they said, we cannot allow another king to rule over us. And so they rose up and they expelled the last Tarquin king. And from this point on, they said, we will never be ruled by a king again. We will have a state that belongs to all the people. We will be a res publica. And the republic was born with the expulsion of the Tarquins. All right, now these stories.
Now we skipped over, unless while I was on the Palatine Hill.
We are going to talk about that in a minute. But right now we need to take a break because we've gone I didn't realize. We got to get that stupid clock fixed because doing this and we don't clock on that isn't on. But anyway, let's take a little break. Now what I want y'all to do today is think about this. I want you to take a little break here and kind of stretch yourself and all that. But what I want you to think about is this: the Romans had these stories. These stories were about, these exposed their values and their beliefs. Their belief about citizenship, their values and stuff like that. We're Americans, right? Our republic was shaped and influenced by the Roman Republic. What are the stories that we live by? What stories do we tell about our history that aren't, that are a little romanticized? Maybe they're not right historically completely accurate. Maybe they're a little, But think about it. Did you even do that in elementary school? You hear stories about Lincoln and Washington and Jefferson or any of the founding fathers or any of them? Do you guys even do that in elementary school anymore? Yeah. On Thanksgiving, do you do that anymore? Do you have like the Pilgrims and
They don't do
all
it
that
much
stuff?
anymore.
Huh?
They don't do it that much anymore.
Oh, well, yeah, because it's politically incorrect, I suppose. But can you guys remember any story? Any story you want to tell? Because people make up stories all the time. But the stories may or may not be true, but they become stories, and they became part of the culture, and they become a way of transmitting and preserving values and beliefs to people. So try to think of some stories that are told. They don't have to just be about America, but they could be about Tennessee or about anything that may or may not be true and are a little bit romanticized, but they are a very important part of the values that you hold dear, or as we as Americans or as Tennesseans or whatever hold dear. So I want you to think about that.
So the Palatine Hill is what they found?
The hill has always been there. But what they found, archaeologists found doing their excavations, they found a wall that was built around 750 BC. And they found all kinds of Greek pottery. Now, see, we mentioned how the Romans were influenced by the Greeks. And the Greeks in the 8th century BC were colonizing Italy and establishing colonies and settling there. And Rome, the Palatine Hill, is it has an excellent location. It sits up near the Tiber River, and it's at a point at the Tiber River where you can cross it. Rome was located at a point where there's an island in the middle of the Tiber River, so that before you had bridges, you could kind of make your way halfway across the river and then get across the other half by virtue of this island. And the Palatine Hill sits at a place where you can see who's crossing the Tiber River. So it's a very strategic location. And whoever built that wall probably was taking advantage of the fact that Greek traders bringing their wares and bringing their goods were crossing at that point. And so and that was probably why the wall was built, to overlook this key river crossing along the Tiber River. Another thing we discover is that early on, probably in the 7th century BC, Rome was an Etruscan city. So we talked about how the Etruscans rule over Rome. Yeah, I got a couple minutes. And the Etruscans were real people. The Etruscans came out of the old simple culture, the Villanovan culture that dates back to the early Iron Age. And around the 8th century BC, the Etruscans adopted many aspects of Greek culture as their own, and organized themselves into a league of Etruscan city-states. And today, the land of the Etruscans is known as Tuscany, which comes from the word Etruscan. And these Etruscan city-states were all ruled by a king, but the Etruscans were very aggressive, and they established colonies and settlements, and it's believed that the Etruscans, at probably around the 7th century BC, advanced into the state of Rome, into the little village that was located there, and made it their own. And Rome became a full-fledged Etruscan city-state in the 7th and 6th century BC. And Etruscan culture is reflected in Roman culture. The Etruscans were really big into their worshiping of their ancestors. They built very elaborate tombs. You can see an Etruscan tomb. They built very elaborate tombs for the dead. And many people think that the Roman worship of ancestors was something that they inherited from the Etruscans. Also, some other aspects of Etruscan culture, like the belief that you could tell the future by looking at the organs of sacrificed sheep. It's called haruspices, and that was a very important aspect of Roman culture. Romans didn't do anything without consulting the omens. They would always sacrifice an animal and look at its liver before they did anything, or look at the flight of birds. They had all these things, and this art of interpreting the future by looking at birds, the flight of birds, or looking at sacrificed livers of animals. These were all part of Etruscan culture that was adopted by the Romans. Unfortunately, the Etruscans had their own language. They adopted from the Greeks their own script, but it hasn't been translated yet, so we really don't know what language the Etruscans spoke yet. Also, the Roman fasces, the bundles of sticks that represented the Roman authority and were carried by lictors or who carried these bundles of sticks or fasces together as a symbol of the authority of a judge or an official. That goes back to the Etruscans. And also gladiators goes back to the Etruscans. The Etruscans, whenever a great man died, they would take captured war, their prisoners of war, and make them fight to the death at the tomb of a great man. It was kind of a form of human sacrifice. And the Romans continued that custom. In fact, and later on it became a big sport. Gladiator combats goes back to human sacrifice, and even in later times, gladiatorial combats were fought to honor dead men. It was a way of honoring the dead. But it went back to human sacrifice. So that was another thing that the Romans inherited from the Etruscans. So the archaeological evidence seems to show that these stories about Romulus and Remus and the Tarquins seem to be based in some kind of factual basis. They're not just stories that were just made up out of whole cloth. And that's why the story of the Etruscan king being expelled and the Romans declaring themselves to be a republic in 509 BC, many people see that as the beginning, as really based, in fact, it probably really was Brutus who did overthrow the Etruscans and establish a Roman republic. So that's where we're going to start on Wednesday. We're going to talk about the Roman Republic, its expansion, and its collapse, and all in one lecture. Woo! Yeah!